I'm going to talk a bit about Ansible today, and as you see, I chose a rather provocative title. I'll come to that in a second, but first I want to introduce myself. My name is Bernhard Hopfenmüller. I'm an IT consultant at Ethics. I'm also a part-time software developer whenever I have the time, which is sadly not so often. And you can find me online, so if you have any questions coming up later, you can find me. And I introduced actually myself, Ethics, to you before, so I don't need to repeat all of this stuff. We are a company and we are doing stuff that you normally put all in the stuff called DevOps, and we have this tool, Ocarina, that we are using for deploying, running, and controlling whole data center infrastructures. If you want to hear more about that, there will be a talk about it later, and you can also go to our colleagues at the booth and have yourself a good look at it. Who of you did use Ansible before? Okay, that's a lot. Who of you knows why Ansible is called Ansible? Yeah? No? Nobody. Okay. I didn't know it myself, but there is this movie or franchise, it's a book and a movie actually, it's called Ender's Game. It's a sci-fi story, and in that franchise, Ansible is some kind of device that enables a faster than light communication, so a real-time communication tool, and from that, actually the name Ansible is coming from. And in that context, I also would like you to understand the subtitle of my talk, which is half of it nobody understands anyway, because two people talk about the physics behind this Ansible device technology, and one says, sorry, I can't explain it to you. Nobody understands it anyways. What I want to express is that not that Ansible is so complicated that you would not understand it, but rather in a way that Ansible is a really, really big framework, and there are lots of tools and little things inside that not everybody knows about, also that you usually maybe not stumble upon if you have your 24/7 everyday routines. So in this talk, I want to first give a short introduction, a short recap as what Ansible is like, how you use it, and then I would like to share some real-life consultant stories, maybe show some things you didn't see before, and yeah, I hope that will be good. So, Ansible in a nutshell. Ansible is, according to the man page, radically simple. If you want to use Ansible, all you require is actually one Unix node to run the master on, or master, I mean, Ansible really doesn't have a master. That's rather called a control node. You need some form of connection, usually that's an SSH connection, and you need Python to run it. Ansible does not need an agent. Ansible is like all or almost all configuration management tool, a tool that describes the desired state that you want to achieve on your controlled node. Ansible is usually written in YAML, and Ansible satisfies idempotency, which means you run it once, it may change something, you run it twice, it will not change something again, because you describe the state you want to achieve. Once you achieve that state, you will stick with that. When you do a normal Ansible run, this would be kind of like the workflow. So the user writes statements or describes a state he wants to have. Ansible would by itself create some kind of program. It would copy that program to the node where it should actually be run on. It would connect to that run node via SSH, for example. It would run the program. The communication within Ansible is an JSON style. And afterwards, Ansible will delete the program and give feedback back to the user. The terms that you usually have in Ansible are those, let's say those are the most important, most common one. First of all, you have the inventory. That's kind of like the infrastructure as a code written down. I will have an example in the next slide. You have two modes of running Ansible. You can run it in ad hoc mode, which means you type a simple statement and it will be executed immediately, or you write a collection of tasks and roles, and that's called a playbook. And a role is consecutively just a collection of many tasks put together. For example, one task would then be an Ansible command where you would write an interpretation of install a nano on my computer. And those tasks, I will jump ahead here. Those tasks are built from modules. For example, there would be a module for apt-get, or there would be for aptitude, sorry. There would be a module for yum, for ping, whatever. Those modules have this JSON type communication I told about before. And also in Ansible, you can use Jinja syntax. I don't know if you're familiar with Python, but it's a very common framework in Python to write templating stuff. So that's what an inventory would look like. You just describe the whole infrastructure you have, either in ini or in YAML syntax. And you can here just combine all the servers you have in logical or functional groups. For example, we have database servers, a bunch of them. We have a bunch of web servers. We have a bunch of application servers, and we can then address all of them by the given name we did here. Yeah, and we can also go as far to already here define specific variables we want to use later for those servers. The ad hoc mode I already talked about is sort of like a thing if you would either run a task only once or you would just quickly like to do a task, which is then the advantage because it's much shorter than writing a whole playbook, right? So this code here would, for example, patch on the web server group I described before, just a bunch of stuff. Then you would be able to reboot all of them with this one-liner, and afterwards with the ping module, you can just make sure they're up and running again and fully operational. A playbook, as I said before, is a combination of roles, let's say more splitted sub things of what I want to achieve in the end. For example, if I would like to go to the final state to have a GitLab server up and running, I would have a role that would just like kind of bake my server before, make it ready for the installation, and I would have a role that would actually do the installation and get the GitLab server up and running. Those playbooks are written in YAML as everything. You can actually write them in JSON if you are happy to do that. I never saw it, but you could. And like all of Ansible, this is very convenient to keep it in some kind of version control system. And one subpart of this playbook would be then the role. For example, here we have the role to install actually GitLab. And this role is built up from different tasks. So my first task here would be that I would like to install a bunch of packages, OpenSSH server, postfix, curl, and OpenSSL. And you can see here some Jinja syntax, which just enables me to get some kind of loop mechanism so I can use one task to install more packages at once. Yeah, here you see another variable that would enable me to dynamically change the version, for example, I want to use for my installation. And yeah, finally, I'm doing some kind of templating, meaning I will copy my configuration I already made up before to the server and get this desired state there then as well. Also, this is, let's say, made for keeping it in a version control system. Okay, that was a very quick run through Ansible again. I would like to give you the opportunity to ask some questions now, if you are interested in general Ansible, before I will go on to the more experienced part. No? Okay, you can always ask later again. So, I would like to share some real-life stories. Those are not so much, let's say, stories where I would say, do it like this, do it like that. It's more like me and my colleagues, it's not only my experiences, also my colleagues' experiences. We saw this, and I think it's worth mentioning it once in a while, because why not? And this is an interesting thing in the Ansible environment. So let's go ahead and start. The first thing we are quite often hearing is my variable's not working. And often, very often, it actually just comes down to YAML syntax. YAML is very easy, right? Well, most of the time it is, but actually there are some fallbacks, I would say, or maybe not to you as you're probably familiar with coding, but when some, let's say, people that do not so much coding have to, in quotes, write YAML, they are saying, oh, this is so hard, I don't know how to do this. And yeah, well, this is some things we saw. Usually, when you write a dictionary in YAML, you would do it like that. You would write a dictionary, and then you would define a variable. And that syntax is perfectly fine, right? You have now a dictionary called foo, and it has one key that's called, a dict and one key that's called foo and a value that's called fine. This you also see, this is according to the style guide. Yeah, fine, it's not ideally, but it's still okay. This is not a joke, I saw this somebody doing. When you write here foo -2, okay, you might ask yourself, okay, why can I not do this? Actually, this dash is a reserved character in YAML, so you should not do it. And this will break your playbook. And I saw people doing this, and they told me, yeah, this is not good. The same as this. This is Pythonic syntax to address the certain key in a dictionary. You're also not allowed to do this in a YAML syntax. Is maybe understandable for somebody who's programming. Okay, it's not so understandable, but this is quite strange. To put a white space in a variable, and I also heard somebody doing that. Okay, why not? And this is very strange. I don't know why you would actually choose a variable that is representing an integer. Maybe there are reasons, but it's not good, and you should not do it, because YAML will break, and you will end up not being happy, because your playbook is not okay, and you might not find immediately why. So according to the style guide, this is the proper syntax, and they should use, and it's quite easy to read. Another thing that you have to be very careful with is things that might break your variables in a way you're not seeing immediately. So let's say the word would be, my Ansible is not working, okay, which is quite generic, but sometimes it comes down to that. If you look at that example, for example, we have two version numbers here. We have a version 2.42, we have a version 2.5, and now if you want to diff those versions, let's say, is my installed package later or younger as the version I had before, you might come up with the idea that I can just use this operator to compare it. This will not work, because Ansible and YAML will interpret this as a float and this as a string. And comparing floats and strings will not work in YAML. If you do it that way, it will actually work, because now both are strings. And Ansible is smart enough to understand that those two should be compared in a proper way. Or, and that's kind of like already the going forward to the next topic, you could be very smart and use a filter. Filters are in my opinion, one of the most underrated things in Ansible, because a lot of people start with Ansible and they try to do everything by hand. You can make your life very, very easy if you use filters. This is, for example, one of the built-in filters that Ansible already brings. It's a version comparing. And that would solve that issue I had before immediately. I would just put in here the version I want to compare to something, and here I would put in the version to be compared to, and here the operation I want to do. And that will solve this problem for you very easily. So go ahead and look at filters. Filters are a very, very cool thing. Also, for coming over to this part, where people tell me we need to do this, but it's impossible in Ansible. And I tell them, yeah, I don't think it's impossible. Let's have a look at it. Take this example. You have a dictionary, here again, dict with 2 entries, and you want to add a new key into that thing. For that, you can make use of the implemented combine filter, which will just combine your dictionary with a new dictionary that has 1 entry in here. I think this is quite readable, and this is quite okay. But what about if you want to remove a key from a dictionary? Real-life example. We have a REST API that gets some request, and we want to add some JSON part to it that has, for Ansible reasons, for deployment reasons, a key that we don't want to have actually at the JSON request itself, because the API doesn't know how to deal with it. So before we actually put this to the API, we have to remove this key. And yeah, when people told us this is not possible in Ansible, we sat down and thought about it, and we came up with this. This task sets a fact, the fact body. And for this fact, it takes an empty dictionary and it combines it with all the entries from the body I had before in a loop. And when I come to the variable that I don't want to have in the dictionary, which is here in the skip production, it will omit it and not put it in. Yeah, this was the reaction of the customer when he saw it. He said, I don't want to deal with this. This is not any good. Okay, so we sat down again and gave it a thought. And then we wrote this file. This is actually a file you will just put in your playbook in your role dictionary, in your role directory, in a new directory called filter plugins, and give it the name whatever you want to. The important thing is that in this class here, filter module, you define a function, and that's the name by which you will address it also from your playbook later on, and you give it some statements. In this case, I will give it a dictionary and a key, and I will return my dictionary without the key that I had before. And that enables you then just to write all this ugly code you had before in that one line. Body, remove key, skip production. Customer was satisfied. Satisfied is a good word. So yeah, that is quite nice thing. Writing filters is very, very easy and can make your life extremely happy and your life extremely less stressed in that context. Okay, new topic, Ansible CLI. Ansible, the Ansible command line interface comes usually with a lot more than Ansible and Ansible playbook, and barely anybody knows about it because nobody takes a look. You might know this still. This is Ansible Galaxy. Who knows what Ansible Galaxy or what Ansible Galaxy is? Very few people. Okay, you should give it a look. Ansible Galaxy is a space where people upload like a bunch of playbooks to do all kinds of stuff. So if you have a new project, let's say deploy an elk stack, you will almost certainly find the role up there and can utilize that. And this Ansible Galaxy command line interface tool is actually made for creating new roles and for pulling new roles. You can search from your command line for new roles. You can look who wrote them. There are people that are, let's say, already have some fame up there for writing good roles. And another use case for this thing is that you actually can use this command line interface for creating a new empty template for creating a new role. So if you want to write your first role ever, you could start by creating all the directories, and there are some you will need by hand and fill them one by one. Or you just initialize a new Galaxy made role with this command line interface, and then fill this and use that. Second tool, Ansible Doc. I mean, you will definitely all find everything that's in there on the internet as well. Sometimes it's just convenient, and it's actually quite quick to use this to look up the modules, how modules work. You can find code examples in this command line documentary. It's just a nice thing. Then there's the Ansible console, which actually gives you some kind of REPL console. Who knows what REPL means? Yeah. Good. When you would open up a Python console, that would be exactly that. That REPL stands for read, evaluate. Oops. Now I have to admit that I don't know by heart what the print and loop exactly. Read, evaluate, print, loop. It's kind of like an interactive console that immediately executes the commands you type in, and this is quite handy if you want to test stuff. Everybody who wrote an Ansible playbook with some more Ginger syntax knows that it can be really a pain in the ass to debug this and to try to get the syntax correctly. This is the thing to look at. This is quite nice. This can solve a lot of this brain headaches for you. And last but not least, my pointer is not working anymore. No. Last but not least, there is one tool that's called Ansible Pull, and this is one thing very few people actually know about it. as I explained before, and as you might probably know, Ansible is more like a pushing principle. So I have my control node, and I push out my code to my nodes where I want it to have. Ansible pull allows me to do it vice versa. Ansible pull allows me to set this up on the node where I want to have it, and it will, if I want to set it up in a periodic time, for example, for cron job, pull a playbook and execute it on this thing. This is quite simple to set up. It can be quite handy if you want to automate your automation, kind of. It can be very handy if you want to reset your system automatically to some kind of state. All in all, it's very similar to using other configuration management tools that are based on this pulling principle. It's more simple and it doesn't have all the features, but it is a nice thing. And one thing that also is quite underestimated here is that it can seriously speed up your communication. Because imagine if you have your infrastructure and you want to push code out to 100 servers. This has all to be sorted from one controlling node. And if all of those 100 just by themselves pull their playbooks from your version control system, this will be a huge gain in speed. And this speed is actually the thing that brings me to the last block I want to talk about. That a lot of people come to us and tell us, oh, this Ansible is so slow. Why is this so slow? Can you not make it somehow faster? Well, good thing is, yes, you can. But before we want to look at how you can make it faster, I think it's quite nice to understand why it's actually that slow. So I try to write up a bit here what Ansible is actually doing when it makes a run. And the first thing it's doing on my control node is scanning the module I'm using for Python dependencies it has. Then it will create a script and add this script and all the dependencies it had to a zip file. Then it will do a base for 64 encoding of the zip file. Will write the content of this zip file to the local file system from my control node and prepare it for SFTP. Then it will find with a bash script the home directory of the user on the remote node where I want to go to. Then it will create a temp directory there in this user home. Then it will SFTP the zip file. Then it will run the script on the target with some interesting structure of shell commands mixed in with Python commands. When you look in there, you can find 16 quotes of layering, 16 layers of quoting. That's the correct way to put it. And I left out here 10 more steps that are included in this one operation to run it on the target. And finally, it will remove the directory on my target. And this is not done with one SSH connection, this is done with a bunch of SSH connections. So everybody who looks at this can understand that this will actually take some while and it's not the most fast thing. So what can you actually do to make it faster? The first, right, I forgot this. If you want to read more about this, this is actually from a guy that wrote Mitogen. I will come to Mitogen later as well. It's quite interesting to read this and get a better idea. The first thing you can do is increase the forking. This is all done in the Ansible configuration file you will usually find under etc and then Ansible configuration. You can set up the number of forks. A fork is usually, let's say, how many parallel processes Ansible is allowed to start on my machine to connect and run to remote hosts and execute tasks there. And the default is with 5. Yeah, now if you have 100 servers, you can only address 5 of them at the same time. So it might help actually to increase this number of forks. A second idea is to use async. I have here a task that is using pip to install some Python dependencies. And this task is run async. Meaning, I will give this some time to run and do its job, which is in this case set by this variable async. I will give it some polling interval, meaning how often will I check if this task is actually done running? In this case, I will give it a 0, meaning do your job and I don't mind what you're doing. Just fire and forget that it's actually running. And I will write, this is this register, I will write the output of this task to a variable called pip install. And then I will do some more tasks that are now running in parallel to this task before. And then I might come to the point where I actually want to deploy my Python app and it might crash. Why? Because this is not done. This is still doing its installation routine, or it somehow failed on the way or crashed. So I will only hear that it did not work. And that's not good. So we will pimp this async by some kind of result check in the meantime. For that you can use the module async status. And this module async status, the only variable it gets is a job ID. In this case, I will give it the job ID, here Ansible job ID from this task before. I saved this output in this variable. This variable describes the whole task, and I'm referring here to the job ID of it. And from this task, I will also look at the result. And only if the result says finished, it's fine, I will go on in my playbook and say, okay, this is cool, now we can actually deploy our app. And I will do this in a bunch of retries to make sure I'm actually not running in some timeout or whatever. And using this mechanism with async and async status, I can, at certain scenarios, speed up Ansible quite a lot. Of course, I cannot, with this, I cannot speed up the booting of a VM system, or I cannot at the same time use two modules. Yeah, right. I mean, I cannot use yum to update my system asynchronously to using yum to install packages. But in certain scenarios, this is quite a gain of speed I can get here. Then there's another thing called SSH pipelining, which allows me sort of to keep the SSH connection open. So I can all those steps I listed up before do in one SSH connection, which will also be quite a speed improvement. However, this is not so nice always, because if I want to do that, I have to go to the machine I'm using in the sudoers file and tell them that require TTY is disabled, which in some cases is not such a good thing. So yeah, you might consider doing this. But there is some new thing which will kind of like the same, and it's called mitogen. Mitogen is per se, first of all, a Python library. And this Python library is sort of creating self-reproducing programs. That's where the name comes from the, when you have in biology the dividing of cells, it's called mitosis. And gen that is actually triggering this mitosis is called mitogen. That's where this name comes from. What does it do? Who knows fork? Yeah, a bunch of people. Okay, so what it actually does, let's say, put in simple words, it will create, as I said before, my Ansible content I want to have on my host, and then it will ship it and create on the local machine a duplicate of this thing. So, and then this duplicated can be duplicated again and again and again. That means I have only one SSH connection to the host, and everything else that is ought to be done there, for example, copying files at the same time as rewriting other files or installing things, will be done from clones of the original Ansible module I copied to the system. And this is a huge speed improvement. You could probably talk 3 hours alone about mitogen. If you're really interested in that, go here to the internet and read about it. It's quite awesome. Yeah, that's what I said. Basically, it creates duplicates on the remote host, and you don't need then upfront disk writes to these remote systems in order to use this. TLDR, it's similar to SSH pipelining, but it does not have this required TTY problem. And if you look at the facts only, you can, this is not a lie, speed improvement from 1.25 to a factor of 7, and a reduced CPU usage by a factor 2 or more. Yeah, and with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I'm open for questions. Maybe somebody wants to share his or her story. Thank you.